So the first season of Ahsoka has officially come to an end, and here's my ranking of all 16 live-action Star Wars movies and series. If you would like to put your ranking in the comments section below, feel free to do so. With that said, let's go ahead and get started. So in last place is Star Wars Episode 8, The Last Jedi. 2017 was a double whammy for probably the two worst films of all time. This movie and Diary of a Wimpy Kid: The Long Haul. I respect the fact that they wanted it to be different from The Force Awakens, because The Force Awakens is also garbage. But it wasn't necessarily the tone that was the problem in The Force Awakens. It was that the story made no sense. And it doesn't change any of that. The story actually makes less sense, and the execution is just really weird. And it's also kind of a cheap copy of The Empire Strikes Back, the same way The Force Awakens is a cheap copy of A New Hope. And for some reason, like, the Return of the Jedi throne room sequence is in this. Coming in at number 15 is The Rise of Skywalker. It tries to be a little bit more fun than The Last Jedi, but the story is still an absolute mess. And you can just tell here that they had no plan for the sequel trilogy, and the idea of bringing Palpatine back just felt really lazy, and there are a lot of plot holes too, so it leaves you pretty confused. Number 14 is The Force Awakens. This is the last film on this list that is garbage. But yeah, The Force Awakens, the story here literally makes no sense. There's no defending it. It's just as bad as the other two sequels. The way they treat the Han Solo character is just as bad, if not worse, than what they did with Luke Skywalker in The Last Jedi. I think a lot of people just kind of miss it because he's fun to watch. But it also completely ruins his whole character arc from the original trilogy. Then the new characters aren't very compelling, except maybe Finn. They kind of had an interesting idea there. But yeah, everything here is just like a cheap copy of A New Hope. I could maybe make an exception for Kylo Ren because he's Darth Vader's grandson, so he has an obsession with him, but they just wanted to make everything the same. And the new Death Star or Death Star Destroyer or whatever you want to call it, that just was way over the top. This was not a good way to bring a franchise back. And I think a lot of people, when it came out, they were just so hyped that they didn't really stop and think, because that's the thing about this movie. We stop and think. Nothing in this movie makes sense. I'll have to go more into details about the sequels in some other video. Coming in at number 13 is Solo: A Star Wars Story. There's definitely a big gap between this one and the last three, and for what it is, I think it's just okay. I don't even have a problem with what they do with the story about answering questions that should have been left unanswered or whatever. I don't think that's a problem. It just doesn't really feel like a younger version of the Han Solo character that we know. And I also feel like it could have maybe been longer, maybe even a bit darker or something. I feel like for sort of a Han Solo origin story, this isn't the best that they could have done, but still a decent enough film. Number 12 is Ahsoka. So this just came out. I put the link to my review for this in the description. I personally wasn't really that excited for this show, so I wouldn't call it underwhelming. I think Ahsoka works better as a side character than a main character, and I feel like all the other characters kind of stole the show. Ahsoka herself didn't really do anything memorable. Still though, the villains were pretty good. The plot was pretty thin. It went a little bit too slow, I feel like, but it was still decent. I don't really have many big complaints about it. Overall, I just thought it was okay. Number 11 is Rogue One: A Star Wars Story. For what this is, I think it's a good enough movie. It definitely adds an interesting perspective. I like what they do with the plot about the Death Star, but I feel like there wasn't enough moments for all of the main characters to shine, in which some of them are just kind of forgettable. So in that way, I think it definitely could have been better, but it's still pretty okay. In this movie and the next few on this list, there isn't that much space between them, just to be clear. Number 10 is The Phantom Menace. This is very solid, definitely underrated. Everything about this movie I think is done really well. You can tell they put effort into it. And yes, I think Jar Jar is a good character. Duel of the Fates is also amazing. Now, Anakin as a kid, I don't think it's that cringy. It definitely could have been maybe a little bit better, but overall, I really don't have any issues with the story here. This is a pretty solid movie. Number 9 is Return of the Jedi. To be clear, this has the best third act out of all the movies here, probably the best third act in film history. The battle between Luke and Darth Vader is done really well. The Emperor is also a really good character. All of it's memorable. Even the battle on Andor, the Ewoks, I don't have a problem with the Ewoks. The appeal is basically that they look cute but are actually very dangerous, and so in that regard they're unpredictable. But this is a little bit lower on my list because you have to consider that the first 30-40 minutes of this movie is Jabba's palace. They're all rescuing Han. The plan here makes no sense, and quite frankly, it's garbage. This was also the death of Boba Fett before 40 years later. Disney actually did something good with their franchise, but up until then, this was like the most frustrating thing in cinema history. And then kind of the middle of the movie, it's just okay. It's really just building up to the awesome third act. Number 8 is the Book of Boba Fett. My feelings are complex about this because Boba Fett is my favorite Star Wars character. However, I don't think Disney handled him the best that they could. I mean, the actor does a really good performance, but the main problem with this show is they kind of had a few different stories that they were going with. They wanted to show you what happened to Boba Fett between the events of Return of the Jedi and The Mandalorian. They wanted to show you what he's doing now at Tatooine. And then they also wanted to connect it to The Mandalorian, and there was like a whole episode with just The Mandalorian, which some people were saying that was the best episode, which I strongly disagree. That was probably my least favorite episode, because this is a show supposed to be about a top-tier Star Wars character. Instead, we're getting the Mandalorian, which, I mean, he's okay, but he's like the Disney version cheap copy. I just thought it was pretty boring, because it like proved without Grogu, the Mandalorian isn't a very entertaining character to watch. Even the fight scene at the beginning, I really didn't think it was as good as other ones in the Mandalorian show. I actually liked Cad Bane's introduction to live action. Some people weren't a huge fan of the look, but that really wasn't as big of a deal as people made it out to be. And as I said, they kind of had a few different storylines that they wanted to connect, and they didn't really do a good job of making them flow together nicely. So I think this show kind of got hurt in the editing process. Still though, visually, this show is really good. The CGI I think is pretty good. And with the exception of those like teenage cyborgs, I think all the story here is actually really good. It just didn't present it in a very good fashion. Number 7 is The Mandalorian. So the first season of The Mandalorian is really good. Grogu, or obviously he was just called Baby Yoda then, was obviously more of a marketing strategy for Disney, but he did make for a good character, and there's a good relationship there. Season 2 is probably my favorite live-action Star Wars season. Obviously, it introduced Boba Fett back, and we got to see some other characters like Ahsoka and Luke. So the first 2 seasons were really good, but Season 3 was pretty garbage. And the whole premise about Season 3 of him going to become a Mandalorian again, before the season came out, I thought that was a little bit too short of a plot for a whole 8-episode season. But that really didn't turn out to be the problem at all. Instead, they didn't spend enough time on that, and they spent more time on Jack Black and Lizzo and Christopher Lloyd making guest appearances on like some episode that was just a side quest, or like episode 4 was just filler, and we got a whole episode of great value Andor. Number 6 is Attack of the Clones, probably the most underrated Star Wars movie. The CGI isn't great, well, especially by today's standards. The best thing about this movie, I think, is the emotion. The way that like George Lucas like planned it out, the like foreshadow and everything was just really, really well done. I feel like this is a movie where pretty much everything that people complain about that this movie is bad, I think is actually like good parts of it, if that even made any sense. I'm not saying it's perfect, but it's definitely like a solid 8 out of 10. Number 6 is Obi-Wan Kenobi, and this is the most frustrating one on this list because there are some amazing things in here. Obi-Wan and Darth Vader seeing each other again. This just adds to the whole Star Wars plot. It kind of adds a new layer. It changes some things without breaking canon, obviously. I think it's done very nicely, and I don't think Darth Vader was underused. He was used sparingly so that when he appeared, it was like memorable. And obviously, Ewan McGregor was back as Obi-Wan, which is something that I feel like people take for granted now, but like they shouldn't take for granted because like 17 years later, he came back for the role. That's pretty awesome. Now, don't get me wrong, this is a flawed show. It honestly should have been a movie, and everyone's making edits to improve it. The one people are talking about the most right now is the Trials of the Master by Pixel Joker, which I didn't even realize how much this show was lacking visually till I saw some stuff for that. The biggest problem with this show, though, was a character, and that character was Reva. The writing here was just very poor for her, where her motivation made no sense. She became a Jedi hunter after she was sad because Jedi died and she was a youngling. She had no character development until episode 5, and even then it was rushed. And then Star Wars has some obsession with fake out deaths. So she gets stabbed in the stomach with a lightsaber and somehow survives. And then in episode 6, it is just so bad what they did with her and Luke. And not only did it interrupt the fight between Obi-Wan and Darth Vader, it was just so awful. And I almost forgot to mention, episode 4 was pretty garbage. Still though, I feel like this is a show that wasn't as good as it should have been, and the flaws it made were just so avoidable. But I feel like we shouldn't take this show for granted because it definitely adds another layer to the Star Wars story, and it did it really well. But I will say, this is where I kind of lost hope in Star Wars. Okay, number 4 is Andor, and to be perfectly clear, numbers 11 through 5 are very close together. I think they're all kind of flawed, but have things that work about each other. So if you disagree with any of that, I perfectly understand. That was a little bit hard to rank. But my top 4, I am very certain this. I'm also very certain about my bottom 3. But when it comes to Andor, the writing here is incredible. And this is where Star Wars just felt the most real. The acting is also really good. It's just all around a really good show. You can't really complain about anything in it. Coming in at number 3 is Revenge of the Sith. This is definitely not the best of Star Wars like some people say, but it's still very good and underrated. There is a valid argument that Anakin's fall to the dark side is a little bit too fast in this movie, but for a movie, I think it does a good enough job. And the emotion at the end is just very, very well done. And the CGI is actually pretty good in this movie. Alright, number 2 is A New Hope, or just Star Wars. This is the original that started it all. It's still one of the best. From beginning to end, it's just a really wholesome and fun film. Some people say it's actually kind of slow, but I think it's one of the faster-paced Star Wars films. What they did here was just incredible. It's all very iconic and just very well done. But coming in at number 1 is the Star Wars Holiday Special. I'm just kidding. I've actually never seen it, so I can't rank it. But coming in at number 1 is The Empire Strikes Back. There really is no argument around this. This was like the first time in history that the sequel was better than the original. And this is one of the greatest films of all time. Everything here from beginning to end, it is just perfection. So anyways, that was my ranking of all live action Star Wars movies and shows. Feel free to share yours in the comment section below. And as always, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.